welcome everybody to this important workshop on grant writing. I'm extending a warm welcome also on behalf of José Luis Canellas, who is the manager of this hub. Let me just say a few words on the KIX initiatives and also on the two arms or two components of the KIX initiatives. The KIX initiative is funded by the Global Partnership for Education, and the main administrator of this huge initiative at the global level is IDRC. It stands for International Development Research Center. It's based in Ottawa, and they have organized two things. On one hand, they have 4 hubs or 4 regional learning centers that coordinate activities, and we are one of them. And on the other hand, they are issuing calls for research projects, applied research projects. Let me say something quickly about both arms. The main objectives of KIX is to promote the use of research evidence for policy and planning, and in particular, to surface, amplify, and disseminate research evidence and knowledge from GPE partner countries. We sometimes refer to those countries as countries of the Global South. And IDRC and GPE do that in 2 ways. On one hand, they have 4 hubs, and we are the one that is for the Europe, Asia, and Middle East and Pacific region. We consist of 35 countries, from Moldova to the west to the Pacific Islands states to the east, including South Asia, Southeast Asia, Asia, and Europe. And there are 3 others in other parts of the world. And on the other hand, and what we are doing are workshops, webinars, courses, we call them learning cycles. We do conferences, all about using research evidence for policy and planning. On the other hand, IDRC issues calls for proposals and actually encourages national experts from the Global South to submit research proposals. And those research proposals are applied research proposals, usually related to education policy, school reform, and they sometimes are individual calls for individual countries, sometimes clusters of countries, sometimes in combination with organizations from the global north. And while we are, as a hub, not able to give feedback to individuals or help writing the grants, what we can do is to encourage you to submit those proposals. And we are able to provide workshops and know-how and guidelines in general on how to write strong proposals. And this is exactly what this workshop attempts to achieve. We are trying to show you how to write a strong proposal so you hopefully get shortlisted and hopefully also get the grant. This is our mission of the grant, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to the 3 wonderful colleagues and very experienced researchers and proposal writers. And they are listed in the alphabetical order. Amy Crompton, Dr. Amy Crompton, is also initiating and coordinating and moderating the rest of this workshop. Amy is the knowledge lead for Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Then we have Dr. Professor Rasha Sharaf. Rasha is professor at Helwand University in Egypt for comparative and international education and leadership education. And she is the knowledge lead, or what we call the knowledge lead or research lead, for countries based in the Middle East region and South Asia. And finally, we have Arushi Terway, Dr. Arushi Terway. She has worked for many years in many different organizations, including most recently for the last few years for NORAC at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And she is the senior research lead at NORAC and also visiting professor at the Graduate Institute. And she is the head instructor or head lecturer for the very new and novel course on innovative financing in education. All three colleagues have a lot of experience and they can give you hints and advice on how to write strong proposals. So the floor is yours. And don't forget, we have language translation in English and Russian, and you can, there are opportunities to interact in the chat, as said by Veronica. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gita. Okay, my name is Amy Crompton. I'm going to lead the first part of this workshop. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the right slide. Welcome again to this workshop, Innovation to Action, Grant Writing for Research Projects. Today, we'll talk about the who, why, what, how, and so what of proposal writing, and specifically focusing in on developing research project proposals. We actually have a lot to cover in just 2 hours. That means we'll just be able to scratch the surface with some of the basics, but it's our hope that you'll walk away with a few new perspectives and tools that you can apply to your grant writing. We'll start with the who, why, and what, pause for a Q&A before moving on to the how, which encompasses methods and budgeting, do another Q&A, and then move on to the final part 4 of the workshop, the so what, which will discuss sharing knowledge and measuring results. Finally, we'll conclude with the last Q&A, and we hope that throughout this workshop, you'll engage with our activities by responding in the chat. So you can ask questions there, you can answer our questions in the chat during each of our sections of this workshop. Okay. All right. Let's start just with the proposal. Keep in mind when you're writing a proposal that there are multiple members of a review committee or panel that will be reviewing it. So what do readers want to know when they're reading? It's good to think about this bigger picture before you start writing. Most readers, they won't respond to a poorly organized or poorly written or confusing proposal. So we want to give readers what they want. So according to Przeworski and Salomon, reviewers are looking for the answers to 3 main questions shown here. What are we going to learn as a result of the proposed projects that we do not know now? So thinking about the goals, aims, and outcomes. Why is it worth knowing? So the significance of what you're doing. And then how will we know that conclusions are valid? What is the criteria for success? What results are we looking for? These questions, as you will see, align with the common elements of most research grant proposals. So let's check those out. These questions translate into these common elements, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. General overview, then looking at the examination of the need or the problem that you're trying to address, description of the project, including those goals, objectives, and methods, answering that first question, the budget and resources, and then other sections that can vary by proposal requirement. I just want to mention that although these are the common elements of a proposal, one of the major things that you need to do is follow the guidelines for the particular grant that you're applying for. And that's what we're really going to look at today, like how we can target specific things to be able to make sure we're really responding to that call. Reframing, this means that you might need to reframe your project in a different light or even different language. Reframing your project to fit the specific grant requirements is a necessary part of the project unless it fundamentally changes your goals or outcomes. Then you might need to rethink it. Final decisions about which proposals are funded often come down to whether the proposal convinces the reviewer that the research project is well planned and feasible, and whether the investigators are qualified to execute it. So you want to be as explicit as possible and try to predict the questions that a reviewer may have and answer them throughout your proposal. One thing what we don't like to think about, but we will, is reasons for rejection. And so by thinking about why proposals might get rejected can help you anticipate the ways in which you may write your proposal to avoid those things. So oftentimes proposals are rejected because the applications do not fit the funding program's mission and goals and then are deemed out of scope. So we'll look at that a little bit, how we can make sure that what your research is aligned more or less with what the call is for. 2, applications don't follow the guidance. So this is something, hopefully that is simple, just reading what the call is and answering it. And lastly, that they don't fully respond and answer to the questions that are asked. So they can be scored too low to be considered for funding. Okay, and I'm just going to paste a resource in the chat here that might have a little bit more information that you can check out later that addresses these common elements. All right, let's dive into the next section, the who and the why, audience, purpose, and justification. All right, so with audience, we're thinking about who is the reader, and oftentimes that's the funding organization. So we want to think about what is the organization's mission, goals, and values. So what are values? What are missions? A mission is what sets you and your organization apart. It defines your specific purpose. So your organization likely already has a mission and values that is driving your research project. And that's great. And you might want to think about what is that now and how does that inform what you're doing? Values are what drives the organizations. So what you believe in specifically. Let's take a look at 2 organizations' mission statements. And so while we take a look at this, I'd like you to think about the keywords that represent the values and mission of that organization. And while you're thinking about it, you can also just type in the chat. What are the keywords that you notice here? So first, we're going to take a look at NORAG's mission statement. NORAG's core mandate is to address under-researched questions of quality and equity and key issues in education and development, and in amplifying underrepresented expertise, particularly from the South. So if you can just type in the chat, what are the values, mission, goals, the key words in this mission statement that you want to think about? I saw somebody said under-researched, nice. Equity, yes. Education, equity, correct. Quality, great. Those are exactly the words that I was focusing on as well. So those actually just those 3 words can help you really think about later on what is the justification, the evidence that you need to convince or to use or leverage when you're writing your proposal. Okay, let's take a look at another organization's mission statement. This one is a very, we're not comparing these 2 organizations in any way, but just to look at something that's very different from NORAG, which is USAID. Okay, so let's take a look at this mission statement and do the same thing. I think, yes, thank you. It's in the chat as well. We promote we promote and demonstrate democratic values abroad and advance I can't actually read it. A free, peaceful, and prosperous world in support of America's foreign policy. leads the U.S. government's international development and disaster assistance through partnerships and investments that save lives, reduce poverty, strengthen democratic governance, and help people emerge from humanitarian crises and progress beyond assistance. So here, disaster assistance, I see, governance, reduce poverty. Yes, those are all the same words that stuck out for me as well. Democratic, great. So those are the things that you want to consider moving ahead. So first, think about your audience. Who are they? What? And then while you're thinking about your purpose and your project, how can you think about ways to align that when you're writing in your justification? All right, great. Let's move on to the next section is purpose. Okay, the purpose. What is the purpose or goal of your research project? One way to think about the purpose is that it should flow from the problem statement and address the proposed problem. So your objectives need to address a problem to help close the gap. So you want to answer questions like, why are you doing this research? And how does it relate to this problem and gap? All right, let's take a look at another example. And we're going to give you 2 project descriptions to look at. And I think they'll be pasted in the chat as well. Okay, the first one we can do together. Okay, on the rural island of Great Place, XYZ country, Organization A and Organization B designed and implemented a DRR ECD intervention to provide preschool children and teachers with information and resources to help them mitigate and respond appropriately to disasters that occur on the island, like earthquakes, floods, and landslides. Okay, in the chat, I'd like you to identify what is the problem and what is the gap. Give you a second to think about that. Yes, the problem is natural disaster on the island. Correct. Disasters are occurring frequently. And then the gap is that I see also a lot of people putting in the chat that there's not enough preparedness. So the residents don't have enough information to respond appropriately in school settings. So the purpose of the project will be to address this gap, to provide more information and resources and how to prevent this and to address it when it happens. Okay, let's look at another example. Okay, let's take a second to read this and we'll do the same thing. Think about what's the problem, what's the gap, and how does that flow to the purpose? Okay, this project will use action research to produce case studies on inclusive distance learning using information and communication technologies. Using comparative data, this study will generate knowledge relevant for improving the quality of distance teaching and learning in developing country contexts. It will strengthen capacity of teachers to use technology in professional learning communities to enhance their practices and promote sustainable teacher professional development approaches. Okay, so what is the problem and what is the gap? Okay, I see some good answers in the chat here. Okay, yes, I see the problem is quality, equity, right? There's a lack of that in the educational settings. The gap is the lack of access to schooling. There's inadequate distance learning, teaching and pedagogy and practices and teacher support to address this problem. So that will be the purpose, to provide more teacher development support, to provide more tools and resources and best practices for how to do distance teaching and learning in these contexts. Great. If we think back to the mission statements of the previous organization that we looked at, this project is really looking to support quality and equity, and that's something that could be highlighted as something that aligns with the mission statement of an organization. All right. Excellent. All right. The last one we're going to look at is we have audience and purpose, and now it really moves on nicely to justification. Your project, your research is important because it's responding to these gaps that we just identified in resources, knowledge, or there's an opportunity that really needs to be filled. So to establish the value of your project, you need to clarify the need or the problem that your project responds to. And I know all of you are very well familiar with the needs of your own context. So it's really just a matter of framing that in a way that, as mentioned previously, aligns with the mission and the funding organization's goals and convinces the reviewers in a way that's clear and organized. So we'll look at just a few types of evidence that can be used for the justification here. So you want to make sure you establish the context of this problem, the background. If this problem affects a particular population, make sure you describe that group of people, including data if it's appropriate. Particularly for research grants, this could be a short literature review, clarifying what you've read on the topic and how you understand the project's context and significance. But even for research grants, it's important to clarify why the research will make a wider positive impact and not just how it answers a specific academic question. All right, so let's take an example of, let's consider a proposal excerpt here. It's quite long, so I'm going to give you a minute to look at it. Okay, I hope you can all see it. I think it'll be also in the chat. Great. So you'll notice on my screen anyway, that there's different color codes too. So you might want to think about that while you're reading it. Like what is the problem here in this example, and what types of description and evidence are providing the justification for this research project? So we have different colors: purple, blue, yellow, and green. A moment to process this. And then what I would like you, once you have a minute to read it, just think about what types of evidence. So what types of evidence are being highlighted here? How is the purple different from the blue? How is the blue different from the yellow? Maybe I can get us started. So if we look at the purple, the right kinds of teacher professional development, TPD, can directly contribute to improved student performance. Holloway, 2006. Oh, I see some, yes, great. I see somebody wrote purple is the research evidence. Right, exactly. Justification using the research evidence to support your justification. Great. Blue, in country, sandy desert, and mountain views, more than 40% of teachers live in rural areas. There's an insufficient supply of teachers. So blue is the problem, but it actually is also the data and the description of the context. So as we said in the justification, providing just a description of what is happening using data if relevant. Great. And then teachers in these contexts, what they already have, they have mobile phones that already have connectivity in these areas. So all of this supports why this research could be useful to this specific contexts. Okay, yellow. Great. I see somebody wrote government efforts, policy priorities. Yes, it's relevance. Relevance to national priorities, policy support for the research. So updated professional development policy for teachers and increased budget. It hints towards relevance and sustainability of the project, which funders often like to see. And then lastly, the green, what's the green? Did I see the green anywhere? I know there's a lot of people here. Anybody say what the green is? Delivering TPD through mobile app technology provides more equitable access to quality ongoing teacher learning experiences, which in turn can lead to better student learning outcomes. Green. Great solution, but maybe the importance or the possible impact, right? We said even for research projects, having talking about what the potential impact is and the benefit is very important. All right. And then finally, in justification, you want to continue to think about your audience. So, and what justification might be helpful to emphasize. So if the funder is focusing on innovation, then you should highlight how your project is different from other research or education innovations that already exist potentially in your context. All three of these things that we reviewed, audience, purpose, and justification, are really important to think about before you begin to write. So your proposal later on, we'll see in the next few sections, can refer back to them, back to these key things over and over. So when you're mapping out your activities, linking them to results, it always ties back to your overarching concept that you've laid out here. All right, wonderful. All right, I think now we'll move on. You can save your questions. We'll do a Q&A after this, but we're going to move on to the what now.
Great, thank you, Amy. So I will walk you through the next step. Once you've figured out what is the overall gap, the problem that is the proposal will be solving, what is the justification of why you should be solving that, what is the big aim that you're trying to achieve, the big goal you're trying to achieve. Need to get into the what is it that your proposal is going to do, your project is going to do to get to that. Rasha is going to talk about a bit more detail on how exactly you're going to do that, but let me get into the activities, the process, and what results you're trying to achieve, and how to explain that in a research proposal itself. So this is often the bulk of your program description. So most call for proposals will have a section on program description or activities, something like that. And that's where you're going to be thinking through this. Now, this is the description of what proposed activities will achieve the intended results. The results are the big impact, the big purpose that Amy was describing, but we will break them down a little bit more in this section and get more specific. Now, from now on, we are going to use the last example that you just worked through with Amy on thinking about providing some kind of a mobile phone teacher professional development program. And we're going to think about this as an applied research proposal. In an applied research proposal, you have to explain the actual intervention components and then the research on the intervention components. So when we're talking about a mobile phone application or intervention for teacher professional development, we are really thinking about describing the intervention itself. What is this teacher professional development program? What are the activities there? And how that will reach the improved teacher skills for improving student learning outcomes. And then what is the research that will happen on this intervention that will improve the knowledge on how teacher professional development programs like this one work. And the program description will also then need to think about or lay out the assumptions as a team you are making on what conditions need to be present in the context for the results to be achieved. And then any risks that are out of the control of your team that will prevent you from achieving those results, even if you implement the activities as planned, or there might be issues with even implementing those activities. So let me get a little bit more in detail with how to really do this. Now, many research proposals might not receive funding because this is the part that is not explained very well. Many research proposals will just describe a list of activities and then describe the big aim that it will reach. So for example, in a teacher professional development program, it will describe, we will do all of this training, we'll develop an app, we'll do this, and teacher skills will be improved. And it's like, what, you just jumped from that. From like activities all the way to outcomes, which we don't really know. We don't know what the pathway is. So our suggestion is to use a tool called, or an approach called theory of change. As a team, really walk your reader through how you expect the activities to step by step lead to the overall outcome or the big purpose aim that you're looking for. So a theory of change approach can be used to write up this program description. So it's not just describing the activities, but how these activities achieve the intended results or will in the future achieve the intended results. A theory of change is an articulation of how activities undertaken in the intervention or even in the research components will lead to that long-term output. Often in call for proposals, you will see additional terms where the funder will actually specifically ask you to describe this in a table format or in a diagram format. And the terms that are often used in call for proposals are theory of change, results chain, results framework, logic model, log frame. They're all very similar approaches. They all have slightly different ways of presenting things, but the idea is the same. You have to find the linkages, the pathway between from the activities all the way down to your big aim. So let's work through an activity here. Oh, sorry. The two main components of theory of change are you have to describe what is the eventual change that you're expecting, and then your theory on how and why this change will happen. So in our example for teacher professional development program, where let's say the team is proposing that a mobile phone app will be developed that will be used to do teacher professional development program, and researchers will study the use of this and study how the whole program is implemented to see how this type of teacher professional development program works. So your big aim is by doing this kind of teacher professional development, you will improve teacher skills. And your theory here will be slightly more elongated in explaining the pathway. If teachers use the mobile phone teacher professional development app, they will build additional skills, which will improve their skills overall and reach better student learning outcomes. So it's a much more explained causal pathway there. So let's see in this example, you're just thinking about what processes you will go through. Let's think about both the intervention and the research. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions to think through in the chat. So what activities, if you were thinking about developing a applied research program where a team is developing a mobile phone app for teacher professional development, what activities will you do for developing the phone app program itself? So if you could put your responses in the chat, let me look through that. Okay, so just think about if you're, okay, orientation on the mobile app, yes, you will need to give something to that. Training sessions, yes. Having a learning management system on the mobile phone app, you will need to provide that. And a very good point, provision of the cell phones. So in our example, Amy had said most teachers have access to it and have connectivity. So that might be our assumption, but we will need to unpack that. Oh, wow. Very good responses. So yes, we're coming up with some very big ideas on developing the app, having some kind of a system there, doing the training, orienting government bodies. Yes, lots of fantastic ideas. So now let's, pilot testing, very useful. Now let's think through a second example on the research side of it. So if we're applying for a applied research grant, we won't just need to explain that we're implementing this program, but we're going to need to think about how will we study whether this intervention worked or not, and then how will we know how the intervention really worked? Somebody already said pre and post surveys, yes. Baseline and line data collection, yes. Impact study, yes, that you can like put people into two groups with a randomized control trial where some teachers are in one group not receiving training, the other ones will. Focus groups, interviews, yes. Fantastic. So you've already thought through so many different ways. And this is what will need to be explained in the program description, that these are the activities that will be conducted. But for each activity, you'll need to put in the output and what is going to happen. What is the result of that specific activity? So that's where I want to go a bit more in detail. So often in proposals, once you explain the purpose and explain the eventual impact, people skip explaining how each activity will have some kind of a result and how that would be in a chain of results lead to the larger impact. So an easy way to think through that within your team when you're writing up the proposal and then how to explain it to the readers is to split up your results into three components. One is an output. This is a direct product of your activities. So let's say training of teachers. So the output there is, the activity was you train teachers, output there is X number of teachers were trained. There was an attendance sheet or something. So you are able to see that many teachers received the training. So that's your direct output. This is something that is within your control. You know if you can do the activity, right? You know that once you deliver the activity is delivered. But then we start getting into things that are not within your control, but are more hopes that if this activity happens, there will be some additional results. So now we start getting into the territory of an outcome. This is the change you expect to achieve through the activities. Teachers can be sitting and receiving the training, but that doesn't mean that they will then go home or go to their classroom and start using the application. You hope that they will do that. You're trying to influence their behavior. So that will be your outcome. And then impact will be, they start using it, then they start learning something from it, they improve their skill, and then your eventual impact will happen that they've improved their skills and later on improve the skills of their students. So that's your sphere of influence. So it's good to walk through what is it that you know your activities will actually achieve, and what is it that you're hoping to do, and then how your evidence building, your research will support to see whether that kind of result, the outcome and the impact actually happens. That's where a lot of the research evidence will come in the outcome and impact. So let's think through this as well. What kind of change? I've given some examples, but what are some other changes you expect to achieve with the teacher professional development program? Yep, teachers will use the mobile app in pedagogy and students will learn better, yes. Ultimate change is sustainability in using technology in their teaching, yes. Change in attitude, yes. And those are the types of things you'll need to study with research. Training of teachers support other teacher professional development, scaling up, yes. ICT integration, quality education, yes. So great, we are already seeing like these are the big picture things that will happen. Now, how do you think your research that is trying to understand whether these changes are happening or not, what change do you expect from the research itself? So you've done this, so beneficiaries' behavior, pre and post test, mindset change, but how will the mindset change happen? Where you do the research, you produce a report, your funder sees the report, will that actually have an impact on any kind of impact in the system? What kind of impact are you expecting on the system? Enhanced skills and knowledge, probably of the teacher professional development policy, or even the pedagogical institutes where they start learning how to do teacher professional development based on the research results you're producing. Impact on policy development, yeah. Scaling up, yes. So those are the types of impact you're looking for, results you're looking for from the research side of things. Go back to this. Okay, so here's a diagram that often can be used as a table, as a diagram. I've listed out some of the activities and their results for it. But this is the type of thing that you would need to think through in describing the program on what are the activities you're doing, how will that impact the outputs, like what outputs will come out of it, which are just tangible products that come out of your activities. And then what is your hope for the outcomes? Teacher use the app regularly. Overall in the system, there's an improved awareness of use of mobile apps and teacher professional development. And then overall impact, maybe there's scaling up of the application itself. And then the findings are incorporated into the national policy on TPD. So those are the big things. But here, always be able to explain how that process will work, how you expect your activities to actually reach those impacts. Now, what Rasha will explain a little bit more that I'm skipping here is the inputs. These are the resources you will need. So budgets, staffing, things like that. Rasha will get more into explaining how to explain that in a proposal. And then even with activities, something that you will really need to think through is the detailed of, like, within the activities also there are multiple pathways on how to get to things. So theory of change is not simply those tables, but a little bit more explanation of if you do a needs assessment, that's how you will, through a needs assessment, you'll do a application design, testing. That's how you're going to develop some kind of a training content, guides, things like that. So there are lots of activities that are dependent on each other, and that pathway will need to be described depending on the word limit you have, but showing to your reader that you have thought through how your activities are actually leading to the results and are not just a laundry list of activities and laundry list of hopes and dreams that somehow it will get to it, but explaining to the reader that you know you can reach those outputs and outcomes with these activities. Then there's the component where you'll need to explain your assumptions and risks. So very simply, you will need to think through what conditions will need to be present in the system. So something that Amy had brought in your context information, you already know an assumption is that teachers already have mobile phones. So maybe an assumption here is that they all have smartphones that have the capability to have the app. Now, when you're requesting for funding, that's an assumption you're making. Maybe after the needs assessment, you'll figure out that they don't have that. And that will be a big problem because now you need more funding to make sure teachers get the actual phones to be able to access it. So being upfront with your funder that you're making these assumptions and they may need to be rethought through after you start implementing the program. These may not hold true. Risks are similar where these are not under your control, but they create obstacles in the future where you may not be able to carry out the activity, or even if you carry out the activity, something else happens that does not allow for the results to happen. So let's say while you're going to do this really good teacher professional development program, teachers just don't have the time to use the app. Or you have planned to do a pre and post test, and then you're not able to access, you do the pre-test and then you're not able to access the teachers for post-test because it's vacation time and they've left town and you're not able to get to them. So that's a risk that you will need to identify. or there's a potential internet outage. So the way you were planning on doing the research may not happen. Maybe you were planning on using Zoom to do some focus groups and it may not happen. So those risks will also need to be identified ahead of time in the proposal. A lot of calls for proposals will ask for this specifically. Several of them will talk about environmental issues. So you will need to talk about environmental or social or political issues. So you may need to describe those conditions within your context that may create a hurdle. Okay, we'll pause for some questions now.
Thanks, Arushi. Please enter your questions from this part 1 and 2 in the chat, and we'll just take a brief moment to answer some of your questions. Okay, we have one question here from Dr. Padal from Nepal. Is it necessary to justify with global evidence? Do you want to take that, Arushi?
Sure. No, it will really be dependent on your own context. So you may have looked through research on whether a research study can be generalized or not. By generalizability, we really mean if you've studied this one population in this one part of the world, will the same things happen in another part of the world with another population? It may or may not. There might be some similarities across, which shows that an evidence in the United States with teachers in a rural, remote community have certain issues. Those evidence can be applied to another remote region, let's say in Kyrgyzstan. So sometimes it is applicable, but in another condition where an urban region in the United States and you're comparing that to the mountainous regions in Nepal, it may not compare. So it really depends on whether your context has any kind of evidence need that is, you don't have any research in your area, but there is some research in some other area that can be used.
Yeah, I would just tack on to say, thinking about the types of evidence that are going to be specific to your research project, thinking about what's going to be convincing to who's reading it, thinking about the audience again. Okay, we have a lot of questions in the chat. This is Gopal Day from Bangladesh. What are the standard ways to test the assumptions in a theory of change?
Could you repeat that question?
What are the standard ways to test assumptions in a theory of change?
So in a proposal, you will not have the space or the time to actually test those assumptions. In a proposal, you are writing your own hypothesis in a way. So your theory of change is what you think will happen in the future within this project. However, in the research aspect of your proposal, and then when you actually implement that program, you will then need to figure out some methodologies to test whether some of the assumptions you held were true or not. So in our very simple example of the mobile phones, well, you will need, as a researcher, you will need to go in and see whether the teachers actually had the mobile phones or not. Maybe you will notice in your data, evaluation data that, or monitoring data, that the usage of the apps is very, very low. You gave training to 100 teachers and only 10 of them are using it. Then you go in with your interview and try to figure out, or surveys, try to figure out why are the teachers not using it. And then you find out the assumption you had that they had mobile phones was not true. So that's how you test it when you're actually implementing the program. Your role is not to test those assumptions before the proposal. You're making your best guess in the proposal itself.
I have a related question, which is, how open and transparent should one be with funders regarding the potential risks?
Very open, because, very open for later on, because if if you already knew about a risk, but you did not disclose it, and then it comes up later on as a real problem, the funder may pull your funding. They will say, well, this is not something you accounted for, so we can't continue this funding, or we cannot give you more money to figure this out. Often they will never give you more money. They might move things around, tell you to reallocate from this section to that section. However, if the risk is so big while you're writing the proposal and you know for sure that this risk will happen, and that will make your entire project not feasible, then you need to question why you're even proposing the project. Because your project has to be feasible and your funder has to be able to see that it is feasible, right? They have to be convinced that it's feasible. So be as transparent as possible, anticipate risks ahead of time.
Okay, thanks, Arushi. There's a few questions here about the theory of change. And do I need to have a chart or a pathway diagram? Will it affect a review? How do I upload this or explain it within the text? If I can't upload a diagram, what are your suggestions for how people can incorporate the visual aspect of a theory of change, or even develop it?
I will not go into too much detail here, but after at the end of this, we're going to share some resources with you. And there is a website called Center for Theory of Change. We will share that link with you in a bit. They give you very good ideas on how to explain theory of change and give you all those details. In general, I would say if it's a form where you cannot upload diagrams, don't even worry about doing anything as a diagram then, but explain it as a narrative. So any theory of change diagram should have a narrative as well. So it should always have some kind of a paragraph explaining the diagram. The diagram is visually very useful for readers to understand the pathway, but it doesn't give all the details. The details do need to come in words, and paragraphs are much easier to upload in a form in a research proposal. And we will share some of those links. So there are a couple of websites, Center for Theory of Change and betterevaluation.org. Those two websites are very useful in giving you different tools on how to do this.
Great. I would also say, actually, even if you can't include the visual, actually making the visual yourself and looking at this website and figuring out what leads to one will help you write the narrative. So whether or not you can include it, I think just the exercise of doing it is really helpful in order to figure out what activities lead to what change and how you're envisioning that. It'll help you walk through the process yourself and explain it to others. I think we're going to have to move on to the next section in the interest of time. We're noting down your questions, so some of these we can get to at the very end of the Q&A too. So, but keep asking your questions. There's a lot of overlap in what you are thinking about and what is coming up here in the chat. Okay, so we'll move on to part 3. Over to you, Rasha.
Thank you very much, Amy and Arushi, for paving the way for the forthcoming information to be discussed about the how. And in the how, we're going to talk further about the project design and the methodology. And for this, it would be really important is to really consider the approach, the research approach that you're going to adopt in order to be able to cross the gap that has been identified earlier with the discussion of Amy, and that would take this theory of change into action. So if you would, it's very important then is to think of the term effectiveness versus efficiency. And if we like look at literature, efficiency is doing the right things the right way, while effectiveness is doing the right thing. So effectiveness comes first and is followed by efficiency. So you need to know first what is the right thing that you need to be doing, and then how to do it in the right way. In the how section, we would be considering that the study design is strongly related to the nature of applied research that you're conducting, and it would identify which theories in literature you're going to be basing your research on, what would be the assumptions that you have highlighted, and so on. And it would stress as well the specific hypotheses or generalizations that advise the research results. Then it depends on empirical evidence that you need to provide, and it proposes solutions for a problem. It entails as well precise observation and description. And when we look at the flow and the logical development of research ideas, you would start with the type of research. What type of research you're going to go through? What do theories and literature say? As you know, the example provided earlier with Amy, she has provided the evidence, the research evidence that she was relying on using her example. And then you are going to pilot innovation on a small scale and then scale it up. All right, some research proposals are, rejected because they are too good to be true. They want to go all over the country, or they want to go on a large scale. They want to go from grades 1 to 12. Those are like too big interventions that do not seem realistic enough. To gather evidence on the effectiveness of a contextually appropriate solution, what is the appropriate solution and whether it is good for this context. I've read into the chat an example from Yemen is that teachers do not have mobile phones. So for this context, this would not be a feasible research approach. And I would then look for another alternative or another approach that would be contextually appropriate for the solution that I'm proposing. And then you would decide whether it's going to be like, for example, an action research where you go into different iterations so as to get the objective achieved, or you're going to use the mixed method, quantitative plus qualitative methods, interviews plus surveys in different modes, qualitative only if you're talking about things related to the frustration or attitudes or professional values, or you would go to quantitative, and you would be able, according to the type of research gap that you're going to deal with, choose the research type for your proposal. Then you move on to thinking about the level of data collection tools. What tools are you going to use? Are you going to use the pre-test and post-test to prove that your intervention has worked? And are you going to use like focus group interviews, for example, or in-depth interviews, observations, surveys, learning assessments? So you need to be very clear about the tools that you're going to be using in your research proposal. And then you would provide justification for the research value, how innovation approaches be introduced and how it contributes to achieving the national and regional and sustainable development goals. And I've seen a comment in the chat that a person was asking, can I mention development goals? Of course, because it's part of the national context where your research should not be detached from. It should be contributing to the bigger picture of the national project. Then you go to consider sustainability and quality and dissemination. So, and then you should be answering the questions, how would the project be able to sustain itself after the project lifetime, beyond the project lifetime? Because as well, some proposals are rejected because they do not seem to be sustainable. So the funding agency would think that they're going to be throwing the money into the air and then nothing after the project would be left into the system. So it's very important as to how would the project be able to sustain the results beyond the research lifetime, and are any policy documents to be released? What are you going to release as a policy document that would help policymakers, that would help the government, that would help stakeholders adopt the results of your research, and national programs to be adopted or integrated into? And this was related to the context where was referred earlier in one of our examples. Then, how can granting agency be confident you are following the best quality standards? and indicators while conducting your research. And then while describing, you would add the indicators that would show the quality of your practices and your intervention. What code of ethics will the project follow, especially if you're talking about child rights, working with children, consents from parents, from school administrators, data management and privacy, so as all the stakeholders are confident enough that this is in good hands? And how does the team intend to disseminate and promote the output and outcomes of the project to target groups like policymakers and educators and practitioners? And my colleague Arushi is going to talk about this into this so what at the end, and she would highlight more of possible dissemination and promotion activities. Then what is the theory the research team should be basing the research on, and where they are relevant research projects somewhere in the world that work hence? And this relates to the question about the international context. I mean, internationally relevant context. I mean, if this has worked somewhere else in the world in a somewhat similar context, that it's a promising intervention that can work in my context too. How are you responding to the local context? What specificity you are considering? Like if you are a decentralized, like in Pakistan, for example, we have a decentralized governance system. So would this fit into this governance system into the country, or into another centralized context in a different country, like other countries? So whether it's rural or urban, and again, back to the context and how relevant this is to the rural values and rural value model of teachers and of students and of parents, that would help make this intervention effective enough. Are you developing your tools from scratch? So are you designing new surveys, new pre and post test, new interview questions, or are you adapting tools that have been tested and validated in other research projects? So it help you, start from where other has ended already. What is your sample design, and how big your scale is another thing, something that you should consider into the data collection platform. What does the national strategic plan is and are targeting, and how would my research project fit into the bigger picture and help move towards the target? Is it relevant to sustainable development goals, especially if you're talking about quality education in goal number 4? The interlinkages with other national and regional projects, not separate islands, because in some countries, there has been this critique that there are many projects, but they are not related and they are like working like separate islands. But if you're now providing a new intervention, how would this build on other the outcomes of other projects that had been conducted into the country or into the context of research? And last but not least, what is the body that could carry on with research outcomes, and is it represented? So if the ministry is going to take on the outcomes and would carry on the sustainability, is it represented? Do you have a representative from the affiliated department? If you're working on the early childhood, for example, is a representative from this sector or department at the ministry is available, is informed, is involved into the research process or not? And what dissemination activities and tools like conferences, websites, and newsletters that you're using? So this is like the overall mosaic pieces of the overall picture that would help put your research proposal together into one unity. Then it's very important then is to think of improvement as the keyword of all applied research. What improvement are you targeting? So for example, is it a study on strengthening teacher competency using mobile applications, that like the example we've been referring to? Is it a study into the ways to improve students' literacy and numeracy skills? So how to improve literacy and numeracy skills with, people usually use the PISA and TIMSS data about the performance of the education systems worldwide in their literacy and numeracy. Is it a study on integrating specific teaching and learning strategies and how effective they are, how engaging they are in different classroom settings and different school settings? If the scope is really focusing on classroom practices or school practices. And we're going now to move on to a very important component of your proposal, which is the time planning. And I would say that this is a common template where all research teams would list the activities and would represent them on a time scale. So I have here provided this table into quarters. So if it's like, for example, a 3 years project, we have 12 quarters. They are here represented in 12 columns, and we would list each activity and then would highlight which quarters would this activity be exhausting and needing to finish. Then other would reflect on the budget. And then we are going to follow on the budget component afterwards. But the timeline as well would reflect on the budget and would represent the financial flow. What is the money you're needing in year one, first half, in year one, second half? What is the amount of budget needed for year 2 and year 3 and year 4 and so on? And its percentage from the categories of the budget, and each template, each funding agency would use their own templates, and I would advise you to use the templates provided by the funding agency for filling into the information. And here we need to consider what is the relationship between activities, all right? So really, activities can have the start-to-start relationship. So 2 activities should start together, should be kicked off together. And they start parallel and they work parallel. So it's a start-to-start relationship, or it might be a start-to-end. So if after I finish a certain activity, I should be starting the next. I mean, the second activity cannot and may not start before I finish the first activity. So it's a start-to-end relationship. Or it's going to be end-to-end, like those 2 activities need to end together because their ending is interrelated and they would provide a meaning to the overall proposal. So for example, like the diagram that Arushi has provided earlier, we have here the needs assessment. You can never start designing an application or developing training program without having a needs assessment first. Because I mean, the needs assessment would inform the type of information and needs and requirements to be integrated into the app design and testing. Then you can never start training the teachers without having the portal or the software ready. So you need first to finish designing the app and developing the training content so as to be able to start teacher trainers. And this, I mean, this track is called the critical path because any delay would really affect the overall project because they are really critical in timing and they each step would rely on the previous one. But other activities like you can start recruiting trainees parallel to the needs assessment. So as they would be ready and available, you have the data and they would be ready to involve into the activities right away when the preparation phase is finished. And then by the end, before the teacher training end, there should be as well a teacher guide so as to for them to use afterwards into implementation into the classroom. And this would lead to, if you would really look at the time plan, after considering those relationships between activities, the highlighting would look like this. So training needs assessment should happen first, and then recruitment of trainers should start parallel and should be, you'd have more time to recruit trainees. Then the app design and testing should start in quarter 3 after you finish the training needs assessment, similar to the developing of training content. And then after the both 2 activities are ended and after the recruitment is ended, you can start the teacher training, and then you can start from now developing the teacher's guide, but it should be ready by the ending of training. So this is how the overall, highlighting of a time plan should look like after you consider the relationship between different activities. The activity, can you think now, we're going to have an applied activity and I would expect you to write in the chat. Can you think of the very first activity that is to take place in any applied research project? please write your response in the chat box. So here, what would be the first activity that should start in any research proposal? Joint review, needs assessments, a joint meeting. All right, so the winner is joint meeting. All right, thank you so much. So who's the joint meeting? The meeting, Catherine. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you. So I'll send you a candy bar or something, a virtual candy bar as a retreat. All right. So yes, and this is I thought of asking this because management activities is really important as well, and it's a very common mistake is that people slip the management activities. So a kickoff meeting where the research team members meet and plan project management activities together, so as they can afterwards start the needs assessment, design, interviews, pre-test, and so on. This would take us to the budget part. We move on to the budget part, and in budget part, we say money talks. And yes, it talks. It tells about how accurate you are, how efficient you are, how rational you are in spending, how wise you are with managing resources. So yes, money talks, and it tells a lot. So we need to be very careful with our budget and how we prepare our budget. So budget would spring from resources needed. So resources are translated into budget. So costing out an activity, we need to think of assets versus expendables. So assets like, do we need cars? Do we need computers? Do you need buildings? I mean, what are equipment, machines, things like that. What expendables, things that you would use to run the activities like staff costs, travel costs, consumables like stationery, utilities, and so on. And what would be the appropriate cost for the length of time? Is it augmented? I mean, is it exaggerated kind of amount of rate or duration, cost per duration? And what is the in-kind contribution? Because really, it's very important that there is this concept of in-kind contribution by partners. And here, costing out an activity, the types of resources like the assets, the important questions here is, are these assets justifiable? How can I judge if those assets are justifiable into the evaluation criteria? And in the resources that we're going to share with you, you would find a very interesting research article that is looking into the criteria for evaluating research proposals and what they consider while evaluating the rationale, the methodology, the budget, the timeline, and so on. And it would help guide you on the way those questions could be answered. So are they eligible for funding? So many granting agencies would not fund a building, for example, or would not fund cars. So is it, eligible for funding? So I would need to check eligibility section into the budget part. Are they the best alternative among other alternatives? I would take this mobile phones example because they are the best alternative if all teachers would have access to mobiles, they have access to internet, and they have the time to use it beyond, work hours. So this would be, yes, the best alternative possible. But if, like in the case provided in Yemen, if the teachers do not have mobiles, so it's not then the best alternative provided. I would think of other convenient and suitable contextually appropriate examples. Are they cost effective? So are they like cheap and handy and could be provided easily, or is like would require a lot of money and might not be sustainable? Because when you ask for expensive stuff, the question is, and how are you going to sustain this beyond the project lifetime? If like, for example, in one of the countries, they bought tablets and they got a big loan for tablets, and now they don't have enough money to buy tablets for the newly designed curriculum. So it's a problem now. So will they be sustained after the project lifetime is another question about sustainability. Then costing out an activity and applied example. If the objective is to strengthen teachers' capacity using mobile phones, like the example we're using all the way, so the types of resources would be like buying laptops, tablets, computers for apps and content development, for example. Are they justifiable? Yes. So are they the best alternative? I mean, I would go quickly through this because it has been already said. Using computers, if this is not feasible, I might think of an out-of-box solution that if a nearby college has a computer lab that I can have access to and I can use it for training teachers, or students and teachers, they are using their own devices. Are they cost effective? If the project lifetime is like 3 to 4 years, and the lifetime of a device is 3 to 4 years, yes. So it's comparable and it's compatible. It's cost effective. And maybe I would not pick a high-end feature, but I would pick the lowest configurations that would go with that would fulfill the objective of my project. And will the government be able to provide technological devices or technological support beyond the lifetime or not? That's another question to consider. So costing out the expendables, the staff cost, who should be paid, what is the contractual policies and guidelines? Are they government people? Some funding agencies would have constraints about hiring government people. So are they eligible for payment or not? The expertise required, do they all need to be professors or senior researchers, or different types of specializations, different administrative categories? What is the number of people to be hired for each activity? Distribution of activities, do all require the same load? Or that's a very good advice that I would give to you. Please avoid having equal distribution over the number of months for the project lifetime, because it would seem like very naive and would not really pour into the implementation and the achievement of your objectives. Do you need travel cost? Are you having international travel or local travel, going to villages, going to mountains, going somewhere where you would need to find travel costs? And it's not a picnic with friends, because sometimes it's the same people going in all the journeys together. So it's not a picnic for friends. It's justified and related to the function of the project. Consumables like stationery and refreshments are needed or not, and for what type of activities, and so on. The cost per participant, number of days, like training materials, utility bills, electricity, internet, gas. And this could be, the utility bills could be the in-kind contribution. So if I'm using like laboratories of the university, the offices of the university, secretariat, printers, this could be translated as like an in-kind contribution from the university or from the partners into the project, which is the co-finance. All right, so now we have here a table that's an applied example. So if the objective is strengthening the capacity of teachers, and the activity now is a training workshop on using mobile applications. So what would be the possible resources needed for a training workshop, and what are the units and the estimated cost per unit? If you can write internet, yes, training venue, exactly, perfect. So the training venue, is it going to be in-kind contribution, or it's going to be rented? Internet, yes. Training materials, food, breaks, wasa'il, which is tools, technology, okay, a place, yes, to host, exactly. And how can you itemize them into units? How, like, for example, if you are talking about a place, a training venue, what would be the units then? All right, so hours for staff, yeah, days for the venue, for rentals, the venue, exactly. 1 times, okay, excellent. You're good to go, guys. You're doing a wonderful job. The venue, yes, you're going to rent it by number of days. So, for example, if it's a 3 days training workshop, so it's going to be 3 times 1, which is a 1 training room. Refreshments, yes. So if you're training 25 individuals, and the cost of refreshments is like $10 per person, and so it's like $250 for the refreshments and so on. So it's the way of how you really break down the resources. So if you need a trainer and he's an expert, so 4 man days, for example, and the cost per unit is $200. So it's going to be, that's of course an imaginary example, and that is irrelevant to any context, you know. A training venue, you need 2 days for training, and then the cost per day is $500. So you need $1,000 for that. Training material is like you're going to prepare like 40 folders. The cost of a folder is $10 US, and so it's $400. Transportation and so on, and then that's one activity table that costing out activities, and then into items, and that would be equal to $2,400 US for the training activity. I'm ready for the questions and comments, and I've read some into the chat, but I would wait for our moderator Amy to advise on the questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. There are a lot of questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I think we can start just because with Rosh, questions specifically for Rosh's section, and then we can move to some of the common questions that many of you have put in the chat. So the first one for you, Rasha, is on the budget, on local contribution. Will the local contribution form part of the overall budget? Can you speak to how that might be done?
The contribution, the in-kind contribution, you mean? It would be translated into unit cost as well. So for example, if I'm a professor at the university and I would be working on this project for like 2 days per week, then and the cost per day is equal X amount of money. So it's like multiplying my rate with the number of days that I contribute, and then it would be equal to a in-kind contribution if I use secretariat, if I use printouts, if for example the average lights, electricity bill is $100 and I'm using like 10% of the electricity, so it's $10. So you would translate that into unit cost, and you would write that it's going to be covered by your own organization.
Great, thanks, Rasha. There's some questions I think that are overlapping. I just want to acknowledge that, is there a desired cap for in-kind contribution? What would that be? And there's some other questions about that I think are specific to the grant, the call for proposals. So I think some of your questions, you might find the answers in the specific call that you're responding to. So always check back to that in terms of what is the word limit for how long your literature review should be. For example, should it have an intervention aspect? It really could be specific. Is it just a research call for proposals that you're responding to? Most of you will already have an idea that's something that you're working on in your work in the education space and your research. So that could be a deciding factor on what call you're going to respond to. So when you look at the call for proposals, is the mission of the organization and the funding call relevant to what you're already doing? And then how can you tailor your application and your response to that? So I think it's not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You want to think about first, is my research, my intervention, is it already appropriate to the call that I'm looking at here? And sometimes the answer might be no, and that's okay. You want to allocate your efforts to something that makes sense, that is feasible, that is relevant. And so oftentimes it is looking for the right call that fits your specific research, and then looking through what the application requirements are. And that will answer some of your questions in terms of the very specific questions that you're asking in the chat. Okay. Another question on methodology is thinking about what is the approach for validity and reliability in data collection? how can I ensure that? I don't know if Rasha, you could, it's a big question, but maybe just a few tips that you could provide here.
Yeah, sometimes it's really very important is that you're going to pilot your tools. So before you take them into field implementation, you would need to pilot that and look at the results. And is the tool really telling what you're expecting or what you're needing or not? So piloting the tools is really one of the validation steps that could be required. And as well, having a academic reference and a valid reference for why you're using this tool in particular is really important, and it's relevant to this gap.
Thanks, Rasha. So many questions. There's a few questions again about budget, about how, maybe you could reiterate, like, how do you determine what is the appropriate cost? What are some guidelines for that you might use, Rasha?
Yeah, I would tell you, like, I've been like evaluating proposals for the European Union, for example, and when a proposal comes from India, for example, and then they assume that this is the requested staff cost. We go to the internet and we do a search on the rates, on the common rates. And then it would look like if it's augmented or if it's exaggerated or not. The number of days required, I mean, if like 100 days, I mean, does this mean that you'd be 100% full-time employed for this research project and that you'd leave everything in life and be dedicated only to this project? So, I mean, it's a common sense. It's like how you'd be using a comparable rate, local rate for the staff cost and the amount of work related to the activity as well.
Okay. Thanks. I think some other budget questions are like, what currency should it be prepared in? Is there a criteria or threshold in the budget for implementation?
Yeah, many of those questions would find answers into the research the call for research proposal. I mean, they would request if you would write the budget into US dollars or euros or Canadian dollars or whatever. They would put a guidance on the in-kind contribution percentage. Like in some proposals, it's like from 3 to 10. In the EU, it's like 15%. So each granting agency would have the rates and the contribution amount. Some granting agencies would identify the categories of the budget. So like 40% would maximum should go to staff costs, 30% would go to equipment, and 30%. So it's each organization would have a lot of information about how do they like to see the budget on their call for proposals.
Okay, great. I have a couple questions about just flexibility in terms of budget. What kind of percentage flexibility versus like what I'm budgeting versus actual costs is acceptable? So what happens if I propose a budget and then after things cost more due to inflation or things like that?
Yeah, that is the importance of the risks that Arushi has mentioned before, because sometimes there's inflation, sometimes there's an increase in the exchange rate. Sometimes those are risks that you should consider. And we have, sometimes we say like it's like 3 to 5% contingency budget for the increasing rates and things like that. And sometimes you would into the project management, we might be organizing project management afterwards. Into the project management itself, you might go less with specifications so as to meet the same ceiling of the budget items. But it's part of the risks that you might think what risk that might face your budget allocation.
Great. I think we have a lot of general questions, so I think it might be a good idea to move on to the last part of the workshop, and then we'll have lots of time after that to address the questions specific to that part, and then just bigger questions that have come up. trying to get to all your questions, but there's so many. So apologies if we skip over yours. I'm reading as fast as I can. Okay, thanks, Rasha, and on to you for the last part, Arushi.
Thank you. We are in the home stretch. I've been looking at a lot of the questions that are coming in and just want to remind everyone that this workshop is about generally how to write a research project. I am seeing a lot of questions come in asking us what our requirements are for the budget, for the program description, what counts, what doesn't count. We currently do not have any calls for proposals. This is not a call for proposal workshop. This is a workshop to help you see what general components are there in a call for proposals and how to respond to that. So any specific questions you have about what is allowed in a budget, how to write, what exactly the theory of change needs to cover, whether there should be a log frame or a theory of change, these types of questions, you have to read the instructions in the specific call for proposal you're looking at. You will also need to look at what the budget ceiling is to be able to design your specific intervention. You may have big dreams on how to solve a major problem in your country, but if the funding is not enough, you won't be able to do all of those things. And your proposal readers are going to look at whether what you're proposing is feasible or not, whether it's realistic or not. So do keep that in mind. Really look at what is the requirement in the call for proposal and respond to that. This will also be useful for word limits. So some people have asked, how much information should I be providing? Well, some proposals will say one section can only be 500 words. You cannot write too much in that. So you'll have to limit how much you're providing. These are just what we are providing today is general issues to think through when you're starting to write a proposal, but the specifics will always come from the actual calls for proposal. So we've walked you through the overall why you're doing the proposal, how to explain what is it that you're doing, how to explain how is it that you're going to be doing it. So you've put your entire proposal together. But in most cases, funders are also looking for your response to, so what? You're going to do this fantastic project research. What will you accomplish from this? What's the point of doing it all? So for that, we're going to walk through how you're going to measure your own results and how you will try to share the knowledge so you can have a larger impact beyond the context where you're working. So most projects, most calls for proposals will ask you to figure out or explain how you're going to be measuring your own achievements. So how is it that you're measuring whether and what results were achieved within the project itself? So it's not just about the research you're doing on the intervention, but what is your research itself accomplishing and how are you measuring that? So for that, you need to have some kind of a monitoring and evaluation and learning system within it. So in the proposal itself, you should have a narrative or some kind of a table format, depending on what space is available, that shows indicators that measure the results. So all those outputs and outcomes we were talking about, how will you measure those? So having some indicators. These indicators need to be some kind of a metric, not necessarily quantitative. They can be qualitative metrics as well, qualitative explanations. But they need to be specific, measurable, or observable. So when it's not numbers, not quantitative, there need to be some kind of evidence that it happened that can be observed and therefore measured. Achievable, so realistic. This is what I was saying. Whatever you're proposing has to be realistic and feasible. Relevant, it needs to be relevant to the context you're working in, the problem you're solving, and time bound, that you can achieve this within the time frame of the proposal. of the project itself. So in the proposal, you would probably propose something like you will do the entire project in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Now, even if you say 5 years, you cannot say that somehow magically with all of this 5 years of work, you will change the entire education system of the country. That's not possible. So you need to look at what results are measurable within the time frame of the project itself. And then just thinking about what is the system you will create. So what is your data system? How are you keeping all of this information? Is it all on paper where you have survey results, or is it all put into some kind of a database on a computer, or is it online? What is that system where you're keeping all of this information so your funders can also take a look at it? And other team members. Sometimes that may require you to allocate staff members that are only looking at monitoring and evaluation. For example, on the KIX EAP Hub, we've had our staff member, Marina Droforte, who's here, who has been looking at that management system of the monitoring and evaluation. And she's able to then bring in the rest of the staff members to look at the system as well. So there might need to be some dedicated resources to it. So in our examples of the TPD app, the Teacher Professional Development app, here just examples of how you would create indicators to measure these things. I'm not even providing you how you will keep a monitoring and evaluation system to keep all of that data and the measurements, or how you will actually do the measurement. A lot of that measurement will come out of the research side, evidence side that Rasha was discussing. But something as simple for outputs that a TPD, a Teacher Professional Development app was testing, showed that the app worked. You have some kind of evidence for that. Have an attendance sheet of the number of teachers that attended the training, or the trainers that attended the training. The documentation that there was a research report prepared. For outcomes, this is where you're influencing. You cannot actually control these changes. These are what you're hoping to have. How are you going to figure out whether the teachers are using the app or not? Something I mentioned earlier was how many teachers that got training are actually using the app. How will you collect that data? You will have to figure out how many numbers of hours that the teachers are actually using, or per teacher, or how many teachers. So all of these types of things, indicators, will need to be measurable and need to be recorded somewhere to be analyzed on whether and how your approach is actually having results. So that's the monitoring and evaluation side of things on measuring the results. But then at the end of the project, hopefully you will need to do this towards the last bit of the project, because you will run out of funding the day that the project ends. So start planning ahead on how you're going to share the knowledge that has been developed in the project. There are lots and lots of ways to disseminate your results. So convince your funder, the reader of your proposal, that you're going to make this research, make all of the information available as wide as possible so others can be learning from it. Now, often we restrict ourselves to just writing a project report, writing a research report, handing it over to the funder. But no one else will read it. Maybe the funder will read it and use it for something very specific. But to reach a wider audience, you need other ways to disseminate that information. Think about publishing it on your website, on the funder's website, maybe some other partners you have, or some clearinghouses like the ERIC, which is an education research, international clearinghouse, I think that's what it's called. So there are these global websites. The Global Partnership for Education, Knowledge and Innovation Exchange website may also, if you are applying for a proposal grant funding for that, maybe request to put the reports up there so a wider audience has it. Then consider writing up articles for journal articles. So look at your national or international journals that has a wide readership put it on that. Before publishing in journal articles, maybe consider publishing some kind of a working paper, which is a good draft that other experts can comment on and improve your own understanding on things. Then think about people who don't like reading long reports. It's easier for them to get the information, especially practitioners or policymakers, to get information in a very easy to read or easy to watch kind of format. So try thinking about making presentations at different conferences with PowerPoint or other visuals where you're talking about your research. Within the global education side, you may be thinking about making presentations to ministries of education directly. You found out something, you want to influence policy, go request to make a presentation with their staff, or maybe do it for the local education groups that exist in your countries, or at international conferences where policymakers and practitioners and researchers attend, like Comparative and International Education Society. Or you can organize your own online platform or online event like we have here, where we wanted to share our knowledge on how to write proposals. So we created this platform and we are sharing this with you. Also think about how to create graphics or short text formats so they're easy to share on social media, on formerly called platform Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp. People use a lot of these platforms, and a short graphic is very easy for them to read. Create a flyer. So if you're attending a conference where you may not even be presenting, create a flyer, hand it out to people over there, where it's very succinct information. The whole idea is to get the findings of your research, your learnings, across to a wide population, wide stakeholders, and so that they start applying your findings there. So that's how you think about the so what. You did all of this research, now get it in the hands of people who will use this research further and improve on your own work. I think that's it for now. Now we can open it up for questions on everything today. Amy, I will hand it over back to you.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Arushi. I think those are some really good tips for sharing knowledge and like thinking about what things you could do to share the impact and learnings of what your research is doing. I just want to look back to a question from the previous section. Why don't reviewers give feedback to applicants to help them? I think this also ties into some of the other questions we had earlier on, which is, what are reasons for rejection? So I think the answer to this question may vary from funder to funder. Oftentimes there's just a lot of proposals submitted, and it's too much to be able to give feedback to every single application. But it's not to say that some funders won't do that. It's sometimes if they do say we're not going to give feedback due to the sheer number of applications, you may be able to rely on just the common reasons for rejection that we looked at earlier on in this workshop, which is one, sometimes applications do not fit the funding program's mission and goals. So they're out of scope. They're out of the realm of what that funder normally provides funding towards. Two, that they don't follow the guidance. So automatically they're ineligible because you have to read the instructions. And then third, a common reason is that they don't fully answer and clearly answer the questions that the grant or the call for proposals is asking for. So the score is too low. Oftentimes, the call for proposals does provide an evaluation rubric or criteria, and that's something that you can check or have as part of your process of developing your proposal, is cross-checking to see, with your team, if you're checking off the box, if you're within the word limit, if you're addressing all of these questions fully and clearly. And Arushi or Rasha, if you have something to add to that, please go ahead. No, all good.
There were like many questions in the chat. I've tried to respond to some of them. That whether the in-kind contribution should be part of the global, whether there is this distribution and the percentage of distribution, but normally in many templates, you'd find that some of the sections are already provided with algorithm. So you need not to worry. I mean, if you try to write more than the requested budget, it will not allow you to. So use the guide and use the templates, and it would help a lot.
Okay, thanks, Rasha. One specific question about the previous section. Would it be wise to track and measure outcomes of information disseminated in terms of reach, usage, integration into a policy? I think, Rishi, if you want to expand a little bit on that.
Absolutely. If you're able to track that kind of information, it will be very helpful in future proposal. So if you're able to show to your funders that a previous work you did had all of this reach, you were very successful in getting the information out, people were accessing it, your future funders will be more prone to giving you additional funding. That's proving your track record.
Okay, a follow-up question is, do indicators vary in input, output, outcomes? Could you clarify a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And it's actually related to another question somebody had asked on if one is applying for any of the KIX grants, if there's GPE specific indicators. Indicators are always very specific to the project you are doing. So you have to think through indicators for your project. What is it that you're trying to achieve, and what measurements, what indicators will show that you're achieving those results. So with inputs, usually you wouldn't be required to put any indicators. Sometimes funders will ask for you to do it, where they're basically asking like, how many staff members are working on this? Basically what you've budgeted for. That's what they're asking for if it's an input indicator. But output indicators and outcome indicators are going to be very specific to your project. A lot of times people think that there's a standard list of output indicators and a standard list of outcome indicators. That is not the case. It really has to do with the design of your project. And as for GPE having its own indicator list, as far as I'm aware, that is not the case. GPE, Global Partnership for Education itself, measures its own funding and its own functioning on how the whole partnership is working, but that's not required to be put into KIX type of research projects. So you will need to go for, if you're going for a KIX call for proposals, you will still need to think through your specific ones. However, many other funders will require you to make sure that you have somehow incorporated their indicators. So that's where, when Amy was talking about, get familiar with the organization, the funder, and how they operate to be able to build that into your proposal. So that's the familiarity you'll need to go through when you're looking at the call for proposals. Usually the call for proposal will specify a list of indicators if they require you to use their own indicators.
Thanks, Arishi. Okay, I have another question that potentially both of you could answer. For sustainability and ownership, do you think it's good to propose co-creation research design with the local government?
Rasha, do you want to tackle that one first? You have a lot more context on it.
The big question. It's a good one.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question right. Could you repeat it again, please? The
Sure.
government.
For sustainability and ownership, do you think it's good to propose co-creation of research design with the local government?
Yeah. Local governments are like a tycoon bodies. They are very heavy to move. So involving through representation would be a good idea, but not really to waste the time and expect is that the whole government is going to be a partner into the project. They need as well some marketing skills. So as how would you sell the idea to the government, and how the government would feel that it fits into the strategy and their national plan, and how the outcomes of the research proposal could be scalable on the country level. So those are like many factors you need to consider before communicating with the government, and before getting slipped into this trap of going into bureaucracy of approvals and logistics and bureaucracy of dealing with the government into a research proposal that might not be a big portion of money, and that as well might affect the efficiency of the resources that you're going to use. So if you use the proposal money is to fund a national level proposal, might exhaust the resources and not really achieve the desired impact. So it's a warning, but it's still having a representation from the government is a good thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Rasha. Okay, I think we're going to wind down the last couple questions. So if you have some more, just write it in the chat. I see somebody, Mr. Nagy El-Shafi had his hand raised, but I think I see the question in the chat too. So the next question is, to what extent is the financial management competence of research teams important in research funding applications? So can you talk about how important is financial management competence, or like explaining that in the proposal important for these applications?
Being able to explain that will always make your proposal strong. However, it will really depend on the call for proposal if they actually have a section where they expect you to explain the management of how you're going to do that. If they have that kind of a section, that means they think it's really important. So you should be explaining what financial management systems you have, how you're going to make sure that that funder's money is going to be used effectively and will not be either wasted or mismanaged in any way. So if there is a section, that means it's really important. If there's no section, then it's up to you. If you see the space to explain that, do it. It will always get you, it will always be a positive thing in the proposal.
Great, thanks, Arushi. I think we got to a lot of your questions, and we really appreciate you attending the workshop. We will make these resources and slides from today's workshop available and send them to you. We also have just a quick links from today's session, just a few additional resources that you can check out in your own time that may help answer some of the lingering questions that you may have. And, you know, really think about what is the grant call for proposals asking? How can you answer those questions clearly? What are the mission and goals? How can you align your research project with the fundings to show that it's relevant if it is? If it's not, maybe rethink applying for that specific call. Look for something else that is a better fit for you. There's tons of resources out there. So I think some of your specific questions could be answered through that, or by just rereading the call for specific information. Sometimes there's a lot of links within links within links within links in the calls, and it takes time. So we encourage you to really take a lot of time just reading through those to figure out, you know, how to best position your application to meet the call. So thank you all for attending. Please fill out our post-event survey. The link will be in the chat. And again, we'll follow up with you. And we really thank you for coming today with all your ideas and your questions.
We have also shared a document, a Google Doc here for you, which has links to other additional resources that you can use to write proposals. So please do use that as well.